The summer heat of 1855 pressed down on rural Georgia like a hand over a mouth, suffocating and relentless. The town of Millbrook sat 15 miles south of Augusta, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single dirt road that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. Cotton fields stretched endlessly in every direction, their white bowls like stars fallen to earth, harvested by hands that would never see the wealth they created. Ashford Plantation had stood abandoned for 3 years, ever since Marcus Ashford lost everything to debts and whiskey. The main house had rotted from within, its columns cracked and leaning like broken teeth. But the chapel, a small stone structure built by Ashford's grandfather in a fit of guilty piety, remained standing, its walls thick and its windows narrow as a penitent's gaze. When Eleanor Beaumont's carriage rolled through Millbrook that June morning, people stopped what they were doing to stare. The coach was Charleston fine, black lacquer gleaming despite the road dust, pulled by 4 matched greys that seemed too elegant for Georgia clay. The woman who emerged wore mourning clothes despite the heat, black silk that whispered against black taffeta, a veil that obscured her face like smoke. "She's bought the Ashford place," Samuel Porter told his wife that evening, hanging his hat by the door of their modest home on the edge of town. Samuel served as Millbrook's unofficial mayor, a position that meant more work than authority. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. Paid cash. More money than I've seen in 5 years of property sales combined. Martha Porter looked up from her mending, her needle pausing mid-stitch. A woman alone? Buying a plantation. She has servants with her, 20, maybe more. All of them. Samuel hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't sound like gossip, but knowing they would anyway. Quiet. Real quiet. Not natural quiet, like they're keeping secrets, more like they've forgotten how to speak. Martha set down her sewing, unease creeping up her spine like cold fingers. What does she want with that cursed place? Says she's opening the chapel, wants to bring spiritual renewal to the county. Samuel's expression suggested he found the phrase as unsettling as his wife did. She's invited everyone to gatherings, Saturday nights at midnight. Midnight? Martha's voice sharpened. What kind of worship happens at midnight? Samuel had no answer for that. Eleanor Beaumont's first gathering took place 3 weeks later, on a moonless Saturday that felt more like October than July. Despite the unusual hour, curiosity drew nearly 40 people down the long drive to Ashford Plantation, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. The chapel had been transformed. Candles burned in every window, their light warm and welcoming. The doors stood open, and from within came the sound of singing, not the familiar hymns of Sunday services, but something older, wordless, rising and falling like breathing. Eleanor greeted each guest personally at the chapel entrance. Up close, even through her veil, people could see she was beautiful in the way dangerous things often are. Perfect features made unsettling by their very perfection, pale skin that seemed to drink the candlelight rather than reflect it, eyes so dark they appeared to have no iris at all. "Welcome," she said to each arrival, her voice cultured Charleston aristocracy, softened by something that sounded almost like hunger. "Welcome to renewal." Inside, the chapel had been stripped of its pews. The stone floor lay bare, except for cushions arranged in a circle around a central space where Eleanor's servants stood in formation, still singing that strange, wordless melody. Mirrors had been mounted on every wall, their surfaces reflecting the candlelight in dizzying patterns that made it hard to focus, hard to count how many people were actually present. Thomas Whitfield, a young Methodist preacher newly arrived from Savannah, felt his throat tighten as he entered. Something about the space was wrong. The acoustics too perfect, the air too warm, the singing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. "Please," Eleanor said, gliding to the center of the circle with movements too smooth to be entirely human. Sit, be comfortable. Tonight we shed the weight of sin through acknowledgement of the flesh. The guests sat, though several looked at each other with growing uncertainty. Martha Porter clutched her husband's hand. Thomas Whitfield found himself next to an elderly farmer named Jacob Mills, who whispered, "This don't feel right, boy. This don't feel like church." Eleanor raised her hands, and the singing stopped with startling suddenness. In the silence that followed, every small sound seemed amplified. Breathing, rustling fabric, the creak of old wood settling. "You carry shame," Eleanor said, her voice somehow both intimate and echoing. "All of you, the shame of the body, the shame of desire, the shame of being human and hungry and alive." She turned slowly, seeming to look at each person individually, despite the veil. "Tonight, we purify that shame, not through denial, but through acceptance, through consumption, through the holy truth that God gave us flesh. And flesh must be honored." She snapped her fingers and her servants began to move. They carried trays now, though no one had seen them retrieve anything. On the trays were cups filled with dark liquid that smelled of wine and something sweeter, more cloying. "Drink," Eleanor commanded softly. "Participate in renewal." Thomas Whitfield stood abruptly, his chair scraping against stone. "This is blasphemy," he said, his voice cracking with youth and conviction. "This is not worship. This is—" "Truth?" Eleanor interrupted, turning to face him fully. "Is truth so frightening, Reverend? You speak of God's love from your pulpit, but you've never felt it, not really. Not in the way that consumes, that transforms, that burns away everything false until only the real remains." She moved toward him, each step deliberate. The mirrors on the walls seemed to multiply her reflection, creating the impression of many Eleanors converging from all directions. "You pray for guidance," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow filled the entire chapel. "You beg for signs. You want to feel God's presence so badly it aches in your chest when you kneel. I'm offering you exactly what you've been begging for. Presence, connection, the ecstasy of absolute surrender to something greater than yourself." Thomas backed toward the door, his hands shaking. "You're not offering God. You're offering— I don't know what you're offering, but it's wrong. It's honest," Eleanor said simply, "and honesty terrifies you more than any demon ever could." Several other guests were standing now, moving toward the exits, but others, more than Thomas would have expected, remained seated, eyes fixed on Eleanor with an expression between fascination and hunger. Samuel Porter pulled his wife to her feet. "We're leaving, Martha. Now." But Martha didn't move. She stared at Eleanor with pupils so dilated her eyes looked black. "I want to stay," she whispered. "Sam, I want to hear more." "Martha, you don't understand," she said, louder now, pulling her hand from his grip. "I've been so tired, so heavy with everything I carry. If she's offering relief even for one night—" "This isn't relief," Thomas shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "This is damnation. Can't you see that? Can't any of you see what she is?" Eleanor laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "What am I, Reverend? Say it. Give voice to your fear." Thomas opened his mouth, but no words came. In the candlelight, with the mirrors multiplying her image, Eleanor Beaumont seemed to shift and change. Now one woman, now many, now something that wore a woman's shape, but moved with the fluid grace of something that had never been truly human. "You can't," she said softly, "because naming me would mean admitting I exist. And if I exist, then everything you believe about the world, about God, about the neat categories of good and evil, all of it crumbles." She turned away from him, addressing the remaining guests. "Those who wish to leave may do so, but those who stay will experience grace unlike anything your preachers can offer. Not the promise of heaven after death, but heaven in the flesh, now, tonight, as many nights as you have courage to return." Half the gathering fled into the darkness. The other half stayed. Thomas Whitfield stood at the chapel threshold, watching through the open doors as Eleanor's servants closed the space, forming a circle around those who remained. The singing started again, that wordless melody that seemed to vibrate in his bones. Martha Porter sat in the center, her face rapturous. Samuel stood outside, lantern shaking in his hand, calling her name. She didn't respond. "God help us," Thomas whispered, making the sign of the cross. "God help us all." Behind him, from deep within the chapel, came a sound that might have been laughter or might have been screaming. In the mirrors, reflections moved independently of their sources, dancing to rhythms only they could hear. By dawn, Thomas would run to the sheriff. By noon, he would organize a group of men to investigate. But by then, it would already be too late. Eleanor Beaumont had begun her work. And the flesh, as she had promised, was ready for renewal. The morning after that first gathering, Millbrook woke to an unsettling quiet. Those who had fled the chapel spoke in hushed, uncertain tones about what they'd witnessed, or thought they'd witnessed. The candlelight had been strange, they said, disorienting. The mirrors had played tricks. But nothing explicitly evil had occurred, not really. Just uncomfortable words and an atmosphere thick with something they couldn't name. Those who had stayed said nothing at all. Martha Porter returned home at dawn, her black dress dusty and her hair disheveled. Samuel met her at the door, having spent the entire night pacing their small parlor, alternating between rage and fear. "Where were you?" he demanded, gripping her shoulders. "Martha, I called for you. I stood outside that chapel for hours. What happened in there?" She looked at him with eyes that seemed to focus on something just beyond his face. Her lips moved, forming words that produced no sound. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse, scraped raw. "I saw," she whispered. "Samuel, I saw what we really are." "What does that mean?" "Martha, you're not making sense." She pulled away from him, moving through their home like a stranger, learning the layout for the first time. Her fingers trailed along the furniture, the walls, as if she were feeling textures she'd never noticed before. "All these years," she said softly, "I thought I knew what it meant to be alive, to have a body, to feel, but I'd only been touching the surface, scratching at it like a child at a locked door." She turned to face him, and Samuel stepped back involuntarily. Something in her expression had fundamentally changed. "She opened that door, Sam. And what's on the other side is so much more than I ever imagined. Martha, listen to yourself. This is madness. That woman, Eleanor Beaumont, she's done something to you. Some kind of mesmerism, some trick." "No trick," Martha interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "Truth. Pure, undiluted truth about what the body wants, what the soul craves. We spend our whole lives denying it, pushing it down, calling it sin. But sin is just another word for being alive." She moved closer to him, reaching for his face. "Come with me next Saturday. See for yourself. Feel what I felt." Samuel caught her wrist. "I won't." "And neither will you. I'm forbidding it, Martha. As your husband, I'm—" She laughed, a sound he'd never heard from her before. Too high, too sharp, edged with something that might have been hysteria or might have been ecstasy. "Forbid," she repeated. "Oh, Samuel, you can't forbid the ocean from rising. You can't command the sun not to burn." She pulled her hand free, effortlessly, though he'd been gripping hard enough to leave marks. "I'm going back. Every Saturday, until there are no more Saturdays, and you can't stop me." She walked to their bedroom and closed the door. Samuel stood in the parlor, listening to his wife move around the room, humming that wordless melody from the chapel. The sound raised every hair on his arms. Thomas Whitfield spent the morning after the gathering trying to organize resistance. He went first to Sheriff Coleman, a thick-necked man in his 50s who'd kept order in Millbrook for 20 years through a combination of common sense and controlled violence. "You need to investigate that woman," Thomas insisted, standing in the sheriff's small office above the general store. "Something happened in that chapel. Something wrong." Coleman leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. Something wrong. Be specific, Reverend. What crime was committed? I don't know exactly, but the people who stayed, they're different now, changed. Martha Porter won't speak properly. Jacob Mills hasn't left his house. And Eleanor Beaumont, Thomas struggled for words that wouldn't sound insane. She spoke of things no Christian woman should speak of. She offered experiences that sounded like spiritual corruption disguised as worship. Spiritual corruption isn't illegal, Coleman said dryly. Uncomfortable, maybe. Blasphemous to your sensibilities, certainly. But unless she's breaking actual laws, theft, assault, murder, there's nothing I can do. Those servants of hers, Thomas pressed, they don't speak. They move like sleepwalkers. Doesn't that concern you? I've seen her servants in town. They seem healthy enough, quiet, yes, but that's not a crime either. Coleman stood, signaling the conversation's end. Look, Reverend, I understand you're troubled. But wealthy eccentrics are allowed to be eccentric. If she's hosting strange gatherings on her own property and people are attending voluntarily, that's their business. Unless someone files a formal complaint about an actual crime, my hands are tied. Thomas left the sheriff's office feeling hollow. He tried the other churches next, the Baptist minister, the Presbyterian elder, even the Catholic priest in Augusta. They all expressed concern, but offered no action. Eleanor Beaumont had broken no laws. Her gatherings were voluntary, and in the South of 1855, a wealthy white woman with Charleston connections was effectively untouchable unless she did something spectacularly, undeniably illegal. By afternoon, Thomas found himself at the Porter house, hoping to speak with Martha again, to understand what had happened. Samuel answered the door, looking haggard. She won't see anyone, Samuel said before Thomas could ask. She's been in the bedroom all day. Sometimes I hear her laughing, sometimes crying, mostly just that damned humming. Samuel, we have to do something. We can't just let this continue. What would you have me do? Samuel's voice cracked. Lock my wife in the cellar. Tie her to the bed. She's not sick in any way I can treat. She's not injured in any way I can see. She's just... He rubbed his face with both hands. Changed, like something inside her has been rearranged. From inside the house they heard Martha begin to sing. The wordless melody from the chapel, but her voice gave it new dimensions, longing and hunger and something that sounded disturbingly like joy. Samuel's hands clenched into fists. I'm going to that plantation, he said quietly. Tonight. I'm going to confront Eleanor Beaumont directly and demand she tell me what she did to my wife. I'll come with you, Thomas said immediately. No. Samuel's tone left no room for argument. You'll wait here. If I'm not back by morning, you'll know something's wrong, then you can, I don't know, do whatever you think is right. Samuel, that's foolish. At least bring others. We could gather men and say what? That my wife attended a church gathering and came home strange? They'll think I'm overreacting, or worse, they'll think I'm trying to control her. Samuel's laugh was bitter. The law protects her right to attend. It protects Eleanor Beaumont's right to preach whatever poison she wants. The only thing it doesn't protect is my right to keep my wife safe from her own choices. Thomas wanted to argue further, but the look in Samuel's eyes stopped him. This was a man who'd already made his decision, who'd already accepted whatever consequences might come. Be careful, Thomas said finally. Whatever Eleanor Beaumont is, she's not just an eccentric woman. There's something genuinely wrong about her, something that goes deeper than theology or morality. Samuel nodded. I know. I felt it that night in the chapel. Like standing too close to a furnace. You can't see the heat, but you know it'll burn you if you get too close. He glanced back toward the bedroom, where Martha's singing had grown louder. But she's already burned my wife. So what do I have to lose? The sun was setting when Samuel Porter began the walk to Ashford Plantation. He'd considered taking his horse, but decided against it. Better to approach on foot, quietly, without announcing his arrival. The summer heat had finally broken, leaving the evening pleasantly cool. Under different circumstances, it would have been a beautiful walk. The plantation road was lined with ancient oaks, their branches forming a canopy that turned the path into a tunnel of green shadows. As Samuel walked, he became aware of sounds that didn't quite fit. Rustling in the underbrush that followed his pace too precisely to be wind, whispers that might have been leaves but formed patterns too rhythmic to be random. He tried to ignore them, focusing instead on what he would say to Eleanor Beaumont. He'd demand answers. He'd threaten legal action, though he had no idea what charges might stick. He'd appeal to her conscience if she had one. He'd do whatever was necessary to get his wife back. The main house came into view first, still derelict and rotting, but beyond it, the chapel glowed with candlelight despite the early hour. As Samuel approached, he saw Eleanor's servants moving around the perimeter, tending to gardens that hadn't existed a week ago. They worked in perfect silence, their movements synchronized like dancers who'd rehearsed the same routine 1,000 times. One of them, a young woman with skin the color of mahogany and eyes that reflected the candlelight like mirrors, stopped working as Samuel approached. She didn't speak, but she pointed toward the chapel entrance with one dirt-stained finger. "I need to see Eleanor Beaumont," Samuel said, trying to keep his voice firm. "I need to speak with her about what happened to my wife." The servant's expression didn't change. She simply pointed again, more insistently, toward the chapel doors. Samuel walked past her, acutely aware that all the other servants had stopped working now. They stood motionless, watching him with that same glazed expression Martha had worn. 20 silent figures in the gathering darkness, all of them focused on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The chapel doors stood open. Inside, candles burned in the same configuration as the previous Saturday, but the space was empty, except for Eleanor Beaumont herself. She stood before the largest mirror, studying her reflection as if it might reveal secrets invisible to direct observation. "Mr. Porter," she said without turning around, "I wondered when you'd come." "What did you do to my wife?" Samuel demanded, his carefully prepared speech forgotten. "What did you do to Martha?" Eleanor turned slowly, gracefully, her mourning veil pushed back to reveal her face fully for the first time. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 30, and her beauty was of the sort that made men uncomfortable, too perfect to be entirely real. "I did nothing to your wife," she said calmly. "I simply removed the barriers she'd built around her own truth, the shame, the denial, the small, suffocating box society had convinced her was the whole of existence." She moved closer, her silk dress whispering against the stone floor. "Martha came to me hungry, Mr. Porter, starving for something she couldn't name. I simply fed her. You're speaking in riddles. I want straight answers. What happened in this chapel?" Eleanor's smile was sad, almost pitying. "If I told you, you wouldn't believe me. If I showed you, you wouldn't survive it." She gestured to one of the cushions. "But since you've come all this way, the least I can do is try to make you understand." "I don't want to understand. I want my wife back the way she was." "No, you don't." Eleanor's voice hardened. "You want your wife back the way you preferred her, silent, obedient, contained. But that Martha was a fiction she performed for you because she thought she had to. What I gave her was permission to stop performing, to be real, to feel the full weight and wonder of being alive in a body that knows how to experience pleasure and pain and everything between." Samuel's hands clenched at his sides. "You sound like a devil quoting scripture, twisting good words to justify evil acts." "Evil?" Eleanor laughed, that breaking glass sound that set his teeth on edge. "Evil is convincing people their bodies are shameful. Evil is teaching children that desire is sin. Evil is building a world where half of what makes us human must be hidden and denied and punished." She moved past him, trailing one pale finger along the wall as she walked. "I'm not evil, Mr. Porter. I'm simply honest about what we are. Flesh and hunger and need. Animals with enough intelligence to feel guilty about being animals. I'm trying to free people from that guilt. By corrupting them, by awakening them. Eleanor stopped before the large central mirror, studying her reflection again. Look at this. What do you see? Samuel didn't want to look, but found his eyes drawn to the mirror despite himself. He saw Eleanor's reflection, but also his own, and something else. Shadows that moved independently. Shapes that suggested figures pressed against the glass from the other side, trying to push through. I see tricks, he said hoarsely. Illusions. Whatever mesmerism or stagecraft you're using. You see truth, Eleanor interrupted. You see the thin places where the walls between worlds grow weak, where flesh and spirit merge, where the hungers we pretend don't exist can finally be acknowledged and fed. She turned to face him directly. Your wife saw this. She understood. And now she's freer than she's ever been. She's broken, Samuel said flatly. She can barely speak. She moves like a puppet. You call that freedom? For the first time, something like genuine emotion crossed Eleanor's face, a flicker of irritation, or perhaps disappointment. She's adjusting. The first awakening is always difficult. The mind struggles to process sensations it's been trained to suppress, but given time, she'll integrate what she's learned. She'll become more fully herself than she's ever been. I don't believe you. Samuel took a step back toward the door. I don't believe any of this. And I'm not leaving here without answers I can actually use. What did you give them? What drug or poison? No drugs, Eleanor said softly. Just truth, just experience, just the ecstasy of surrendering to something greater than your small, frightened self. She moved toward him again, and Samuel found he couldn't back away further. His feet felt rooted to the stone floor. You're afraid, Mr. Porter. I can smell it on you. But underneath the fear, there's curiosity, hunger. The same thing that drew your wife to me draws you now, whether you admit it or not. You're insane. Perhaps. Eleanor smiled. But sanity is just another cage, isn't it? Another way of limiting what you're allowed to feel and think and want. She raised one hand, and the candles flickered in unison, despite the lack of wind. Stay, Mr. Porter. Let me show you what your wife experienced. Let me prove that I'm not the monster you think I am. Samuel wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to get as far from this woman and this chapel as possible, but his body wouldn't obey. He stood frozen, watching as Eleanor's servants began to file into the chapel, forming their circle, beginning their wordless song. Just one night, Eleanor whispered, her voice somehow audible above the singing. Just one experience. Then you can decide for yourself whether I'm saving souls or damning them. The mirrors on the walls began to glow with their own light, no longer simply reflecting but emanating something that felt older than candlelight, deeper than fire. Samuel tried to speak, to object, to pray, but his voice had abandoned him. Eleanor Beaumont smiled, and in that smile Samuel saw both incredible beauty and absolute horror. She raised her arms, and the singing grew louder and the mirrors blazed brighter, and Samuel Porter felt something inside him begin to crack. Welcome, Eleanor said, her voice echoing from every surface. To renewal. The chapel doors swung shut. Outside, in the gathering darkness, Thomas Whitfield waited at the Porter house, as he'd been instructed. He waited through sunset, through full dark, through the small hours of the morning, when the world feels most fragile. Samuel Porter never came home. 3 days passed. Samuel Porter remained missing. The sheriff organized a search party, but when they arrived at Ashford Plantation, Eleanor Beaumont greeted them with perfect courtesy and allowed them to search every building. They found nothing suspicious, just a wealthy, eccentric woman and her unusually quiet servants tending to a property she was clearly renovating with considerable expense. Mr. Porter never arrived here, Eleanor told Sheriff Coleman, her face a mask of concern. I'm terribly sorry to hear he's missing. If I see him, I'll send word immediately. The sheriff had no choice but to believe her. There was no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, nothing that would justify further investigation. Samuel Porter had simply vanished, like water poured into thirsty ground. Martha Porter received the news with disturbing calm. She sat in her parlor, hands folded in her lap, and said simply, "He's found something better than me, I understand." Thomas Whitfield, increasingly desperate, tried once more to rally opposition. He stood on the church steps the following Sunday, addressing the congregation after services. "Something evil has come to Millbrook," he announced, his young voice cracking with passion. "Eleanor Beaumont is not what she claims. She's corrupting our community, stealing our neighbors, destroying families. We must act before more people are lost." But his words fell on deaf ears. Half the congregation had already attended Eleanor's gatherings. They sat in the pews with that same glazed expression, humming tunelessly under their breath during hymns. The other half was too afraid or too apathetic to take action against a wealthy woman with powerful connections. After the service, Jacob Mills approached Thomas with shuffling steps. The old farmer had aged a decade in a week, his face drawn and his eyes haunted. "I went back," Jacob whispered, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. "Last Saturday. I couldn't stay away. Something inside me needed what she offered." "What did she offer?" Thomas asked urgently. "Jacob, what happens in that chapel?" The old man's eyes filled with tears. "I can't say it. The words won't come. She does something, shows something. I don't know how to describe it. It's like she peels back your skin and shows you all the things you've been hiding from yourself, all the wants and needs and hungers you've pretended don't exist." He gripped Thomas's arm with surprising strength. "It should be horrible. It should feel like violation. But it doesn't. It feels like coming home after being lost your whole life. Jacob, that's not real. Whatever she's doing, it's manipulation." "Possibly drugs, or—" "It's real," Jacob interrupted. "More real than anything else I've ever felt, and that's what terrifies me." He released Thomas's arm, stepping back. "I'm going again next Saturday. I have to. I can't stop myself, and neither can you, if you go there. So don't. Stay away from Ashford Plantation. Stay away from Eleanor Beaumont, because once you see what she shows you, you can't unsee it." The old man walked away, leaving Thomas standing on the church steps, feeling more alone than he'd ever felt in his life. That night, Thomas made a decision. If the law wouldn't act, if the community wouldn't act, then he would have to act alone. He would go to Ashford Plantation, not to attend one of Eleanor's gatherings, but to investigate, to find evidence of whatever she was doing, to rescue Samuel Porter if he was still alive. He prepared carefully. He told his landlady he was traveling to Augusta and wouldn't return for several days, establishing an alibi for his absence. He wrote letters to his family and to his superior in the Methodist Church, explaining his suspicions about Eleanor Beaumont and leaving them sealed with instructions to be opened if he didn't return. Then, as midnight approached on Tuesday, a night when no gathering was scheduled, Thomas walked to Ashford Plantation. The road felt different at night. The oak canopy that provided pleasant shade during the day now created a tunnel of absolute darkness, broken only by Thomas's lantern. He walked quietly, staying to the edge of the road, ready to hide if he heard anyone approaching. As he neared the plantation, Thomas extinguished his lantern. The main house was dark, as expected, but the chapel glowed with soft light, as if candles burned inside even though no gathering was scheduled. Thomas crept closer, avoiding the main path. He moved through the overgrown gardens, ducking behind crumbling walls and tangled rose bushes. Eleanor's servants were nowhere to be seen, which struck him as odd. Surely they didn't all sleep in the main house, which remained too damaged for comfortable habitation. The chapel had small windows, set high in the walls. Thomas found a crumbling stone bench and dragged it to the side of the building, climbing carefully to peer through the narrow opening. What he saw made his breath catch. The chapel interior was transformed. The mirrors on the walls reflected not the candle-lit space, but something else entirely. Vast rooms filled with writhing figures. A ballroom where people danced with partners who seemed to shift and change with every turn. Their features fluid, their bodies moving in ways human bodies shouldn't move. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. In the center of the chapel floor, Samuel Porter lay motionless. He was alive. Thomas could see his chest rising and falling, but his eyes were open and unseeing, staring at the ceiling with an expression of absolute rapture. Around him, Eleanor's servants knelt in a circle, their hands pressed to the stone floor, their mouths moving in silent prayer or incantation. Eleanor Beaumont herself stood before the largest mirror, now fully unveiled. She wore a white dress that seemed to glow with its own light, and she was speaking, though Thomas couldn't hear the words through the thick stone walls. As she spoke, the reflections in the mirrors began to move more frantically. The figures in the impossible ballroom pressed against the glass as if trying to break through. Thomas nearly fell from his perch. He steadied himself against the chapel wall, heart hammering. He needed to get inside, needed to somehow free Samuel Porter, needed to stop whatever ritual Eleanor was performing. But before he could act, a hand closed around his ankle. Thomas looked down to see one of Eleanor's servants, the young woman with mahogany skin, staring up at him with those mirror-bright eyes. She didn't speak, but her grip was iron strong. She pulled, and Thomas tumbled from the bench, landing hard in the dirt. He scrambled to his feet, ready to run, but found himself surrounded. Every one of Eleanor's 20 servants had materialized from the darkness, forming a silent circle around him. They didn't attack, didn't threaten. They simply stood, waiting, watching with those terrible glazed eyes. The chapel door opened, and Eleanor Beaumont emerged. She was still wearing the glowing white dress, and up close Thomas could see it wasn't cloth at all, but something that moved and shifted like living tissue. "Reverend Whitfield," she said pleasantly, as if greeting a guest at a social gathering. "How persistent you are. I was beginning to think you'd never give me a proper opportunity." "Let me go," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Let Samuel Porter go. Whatever you're doing here, it ends tonight." Eleanor tilted her head, studying him with an expression between amusement and pity. "It's interesting," she said, "how young men always believe they can save the world through courage and conviction. How they never realize that courage is just another form of hunger, and conviction is just fear dressed in righteous clothing. I'm not afraid of you." "Yes, you are." Eleanor moved closer, her servants parting to let her pass. "You're terrified. Not of me specifically, but of what I represent. The proof that everything you believe might be wrong. That God might be crueler or more absent than you can accept. That the flesh might be more important than the soul. That pleasure might matter more than virtue." "Blasphemy," Thomas spat. "Truth," Eleanor corrected gently. "Uncomfortable, unwanted truth. The kind that shatters illusions and leaves you naked before reality." She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in the heat. "But I'm not unreasonable, Reverend. I'll make you an offer. Come inside, experience one of my gatherings, see what I actually do, and if, after that, you still want to leave, to report me, to try to stop me, you'll be free to do so." "I don't believe you." "Why would I lie?" Eleanor's smile was genuine, which somehow made it more unsettling. "If I wanted you dead or disappeared, my servants would have already accomplished that. No, I want something more interesting from you. I want you to understand, to see that what I'm offering isn't damnation, but liberation. And if I refuse," Eleanor's expression hardened, "then my servants will restrain you until you're calm enough to be reasonable. Either way, you're coming inside that chapel. The only question is whether you walk with dignity or are carried like a prisoner." Thomas looked around at the silent circle of servants. He was outnumbered 20-1, and they were clearly capable of overwhelming him. He could try to fight, but it would be futile. His only chance was to pretend to cooperate, to look for an opportunity to escape and get help. "Fine," he said. "I'll come inside. I'll see your gathering. But I'm not promising to believe anything you say." "I'm not asking you to believe," Eleanor replied. "I'm asking you to experience. Belief will follow naturally." She turned and walked back toward the chapel. Thomas followed, the servants falling into step behind him like a silent honor guard. As they passed through the doors, Thomas caught a last glimpse of the night sky, stars scattered across the darkness like the eyes of distant witnesses. Then the doors closed behind him, and he was inside. The chapel was exactly as he'd seen through the window. Samuel Porter still lay motionless in the center, servants kneeling around him. But now Thomas could see details he'd missed. The way Samuel's fingers twitched in rhythm with some unheard music, the tears streaming down his face, the smile pulling at his lips. "What have you done to him?" Thomas demanded. "I've given him what he came seeking," Eleanor said. "Permission to stop fighting himself. He spent his whole life being what others expected, a good husband, a responsible citizen, a man who controlled his appetites and denied his nature. I showed him what it would feel like to surrender all that, to just exist, to feel everything without judgment. That's not living. That's everything you're afraid of." Eleanor moved to stand beside Samuel, looking down at him with something that might have been affection. "He's been like this for 3 days, experiencing what your philosophers call the eternal now. No past, no future, just an endless present of pure sensation. And when he wakes, if he wakes, he'll be more authentically himself than he's ever been." Thomas felt sick. "You've destroyed him." "I've freed him." Eleanor raised her arms, and the servants began to hum that wordless melody. "And now, Reverend, I'll free you." The candles flickered. The mirrors on the walls began to glow. And in their reflection, Thomas saw the ballroom Eleanor had somehow created, or revealed, or connected to. A vast space, filled with figures dancing to music he could almost hear. Music that made his bones ache and his skin prickle with something between dread and desire. "No," he said, backing toward the door. "I won't. I can't." But the servants were behind him, blocking the exit. Eleanor advanced slowly, her white dress seeming to spread across the floor like spilled milk. "You've wanted this your whole life," she said softly, "to stop performing, to stop pretending, to stop being the good boy who says the right prayers and denies the wrong thoughts. I can see it in you, Reverend, the hunger for something more, the suspicion that all your faith might be built on lies you tell yourself to avoid facing the truth." "What truth?" Thomas demanded, his voice breaking. Eleanor smiled, and in the mirror behind her, 1,000 Eleanors smiled in unison. "That God is silent because God doesn't care. That virtue is just another prison. That the only meaning in this world is what we can feel and taste and touch. That the flesh is all we have, and wasting it on shame is the only real sin." She reached for him, her pale fingers extending like branches. "Let me show you," she whispered. "Let me prove it." Thomas tried to resist. He prayed aloud, reciting psalms and prayers, calling on God for protection and strength. But his voice grew quieter with each word, his conviction wavering as the humming grew louder and the mirrors grew brighter, and Eleanor's hand touched his face with a cold that burned. "There," she said gently, as if comforting a child. "Stop fighting. Just feel." And Thomas Whitfield, Methodist minister, believer in God and righteousness and the eternal soul, felt something inside him crack and open like a seed splitting to let something new grow through. The mirrors showed him things. The servants sang things, Eleanor whispered things, and Thomas began to understand. When Thomas Whitfield opened his eyes, he didn't know how much time had passed. Minutes, hours, days. The concept of duration felt meaningless, as if he'd been existing outside time's normal flow. He was lying on the cold stone floor of the chapel. His clothes were intact, his body unharmed. But something fundamental had shifted inside him, like furniture rearranged in a familiar room, making everything feel simultaneously recognizable and wrong. "Welcome back, Reverend." Eleanor's voice came from somewhere above him. Thomas sat up slowly, his head pounding. Eleanor stood by the largest mirror, still wearing that unsettling white dress. Samuel Porter was gone from the center of the floor, though Thomas had no memory of him being moved. What did you do to me?" Thomas's voice sounded strange to his own ears, deeper, rougher, as if someone else was using his throat to speak. "I didn't do anything," Eleanor replied. "I simply removed the barriers you'd erected between yourself and truth. The rest was all you, Reverend. All the things you saw, all the things you felt, those came from inside you. I just provided the key to unlock the door you'd been keeping so desperately closed." Thomas tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. He remained on the floor, staring at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. "I saw—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The images that had flooded through him during whatever Eleanor had done were already fragmenting, breaking apart like a dream upon waking. But the feelings remained, a vast, terrible understanding of something he couldn't put into words. "You saw what the world really is," Eleanor said, moving closer. "Not the pretty story your Bible tells. Not the comforting lies about divine love and cosmic justice. You saw the raw, indifferent machinery of existence, the way flesh hungers and breaks and dies, the way consciousness is just a brief flicker in an ocean of nothingness, the way everything you believe is just a story you tell yourself to avoid facing the void." "No," Thomas whispered, but it sounded more like a question than a denial. "Yes." Eleanor knelt beside him, her face level with his. Up close, he could see that her eyes weren't quite right, the pupils too large, the irises shot through with colors that shouldn't exist in human eyes. "But here's the beautiful part, Reverend. Once you accept the void, once you acknowledge the meaninglessness, you're free. Free to pursue pleasure without guilt, free to indulge every appetite without shame, free to live in your body instead of trying to transcend it." Thomas wanted to argue, to denounce her, to cling to his faith. But the words wouldn't come. Everything she said resonated with something deep inside him, something that had perhaps always been there, waiting. He thought of all the nights he'd lain awake, struggling with doubts, all the prayers that had gone unanswered, all the suffering he'd witnessed that no loving God should allow. What if Eleanor was right? What if faith was just elaborate self-deception? "I can see you considering it," Eleanor said, reading his expression. "Good. Doubt is the beginning of wisdom. Question everything you were taught. Test it against what you actually experience. And you'll find, as I did, that the only reliable truth is the truth of the body. Pain and pleasure, hunger and satiation. The flesh is honest in ways the spirit can never be." She stood, offering her hand to help him up. Thomas stared at it for a long moment before taking it. Her skin was cold, but her grip was strong, pulling him to his feet with surprising ease. "What happens now?" he asked. "That depends on you." Eleanor released his hand and moved toward the chapel doors. "You're free to leave, free to report what you've seen to the sheriff, to write to your church superiors, to try to stop me, but I don't think you will. Why not?" She smiled over her shoulder. "Because you're curious now, because you want to see more, feel more, understand more. Because I've planted a seed in you, and it's already growing. You can fight it. That's your choice. But fighting only makes it grow faster." The doors opened, revealing pre-dawn darkness. Thomas hadn't realized an entire night had passed. Eleanor's servants filed into the chapel, moving with their characteristic silence, beginning their morning tasks of refreshing candles and cleaning. "Go home, Reverend," Eleanor said. "Rest. Think about what you experienced. And on Saturday night, if you choose, come back. I'll welcome you properly then." Show you everything I showed the others. Transform your understanding completely. Thomas stumbled toward the doors, desperate for fresh air and space to think. But as he reached the threshold, a thought struck him. "Where's Samuel Porter?" "Recovering," Eleanor said simply. "The first awakening is always intense. He needs time to integrate what he learned, but he'll be fine. Better than fine, actually. He'll be reborn." "And Martha? What about his wife?" "Martha understands. When Samuel is ready, they'll reunite. Not as husband and wife bound by society's rules, but as two free beings choosing connection. It will be beautiful." Thomas wanted to call her insane, to reject everything she'd said. But his certainty was gone, eroded by whatever he'd experienced in the chapel. He walked out into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving Eleanor Beaumont and her servants behind. The walk back to Millbrook felt endless. Thomas's mind spun with contradictory thoughts and feelings. Part of him wanted to run to Sheriff Coleman immediately, to demand action against Eleanor, but another part, a growing part, whispered that she'd shown him truth. Terrible, liberating truth. By the time he reached his small room above the general store, the sun was rising. Thomas collapsed onto his bed fully clothed, exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. He felt hollowed out, as if something essential had been scooped from inside him, leaving only questions and doubts where certainty had once lived. He slept fitfully, dreaming of mirrors and ballrooms and figures that danced with too many limbs. When he woke in the afternoon, his landlady was knocking on his door, concerned he'd missed his usual breakfast and lunch. "I'm fine, Mrs. Henderson," he called through the door, his voice hoarse. "Just feeling unwell. I'll rest today." She left him alone, and Thomas lay staring at the ceiling, watching dust motes drift through the sunlight streaming from his window. He tried to pray, but found the words stuck in his throat. What was the point of prayer if no one was listening? What was the point of faith if it was just elaborate fiction? "No," he told himself firmly, "this is exactly what she wants. To make you doubt, to corrupt your thinking. You experience something, hallucination, mesmerism, possibly drug-induced, but it wasn't truth. It was deception dressed as revelation. But the doubts remained, gnawing at him like insects eating wood from the inside. Over the next 3 days, Thomas watched Millbrook transform. More people attended Eleanor's Saturday gathering, nearly 70 this time, drawn by word-of-mouth testimonials from those who'd experienced her renewal. They went into the chapel as ordinary citizens, farmers, shopkeepers, housewives, laborers. They emerged changed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but subtly, fundamentally altered. They moved differently, as if suddenly aware of their bodies in new ways. They spoke less, but touched more. Hands on shoulders, fingers trailing along arms, embraces that lasted longer than propriety allowed. They smiled at private jokes no one else understood, and hummed that wordless melody during quiet moments. The town began to feel alien to Thomas. Conversations stopped when he approached. People looked at him with knowing expressions, as if they could see the crack Eleanor had opened inside him. Several even approached him, urging him to return to the chapel. "It's like being born again," Martha Porter told him when he encountered her at the market. She looked healthier than she had in weeks, her skin glowing, her movements fluid. "But for real this time, not metaphorically, actually feeling like you're new. Martha, your husband is still missing." "Sam is exactly where he needs to be," she interrupted, her voice serene. "Learning what I learned. Soon we'll be together again, but different. Better. Free from all the little lies marriage told us we had to perform." Thomas wanted to shake her, to break through whatever spell Eleanor had cast, but Martha simply smiled at him with pity and walked away, humming. That night, Thomas sat in his room writing a detailed letter to his Methodist superior in Savannah, describing everything he'd witnessed at Ashford Plantation. He wrote about Eleanor's gatherings, about the changed behavior of attendees, about Samuel Porter's disappearance, about the strange ritual he'd witnessed. He sealed the letter and planned to post it the next morning. But when he woke, he found himself staring at the sealed envelope with growing uncertainty. What exactly had he witnessed? Nothing explicitly illegal, nothing he could prove, just uncomfortable gatherings that people attended voluntarily and left appearing different. Would his superior even believe him? Or would the letter make Thomas sound unhinged, ranting about mirrors and mesmerism and spiritual corruption? He left the letter unsealed on his desk. Saturday arrived with oppressive heat. Thunderclouds gathered on the horizon, promising storms, but delivering only humidity that made breathing feel like drowning. Thomas spent the day in his room, fighting with himself. He shouldn't go to the chapel. He knew that with absolute certainty. Whatever Eleanor Beaumont offered wasn't salvation, but damnation disguised as freedom. He should post his letter, pack his belongings, and leave Millbrook entirely before he was further corrupted. But as evening approached, he found himself walking toward Ashford Plantation anyway. His feet carried him down the oak-lined road, while his mind screamed protests. He told himself he was going to observe, to gather more evidence, to understand Eleanor's methods so he could effectively combat them. But he knew with sinking certainty that he was lying to himself. He wanted to feel again what he'd felt that night in the chapel. Wanted to experience that terrible, liberating sensation of everything he believed crumbling away. Wanted to stop fighting the doubts that had plagued him since seminary and simply surrender to them. The chapel blazed with candlelight when he arrived. People were already filing inside, faces he recognized from church, from the market, from town council meetings. They greeted him with knowing smiles, as if welcoming him into a secret society. Eleanor Beaumont stood at the entrance, greeting each arrival personally. When Thomas approached, she didn't look surprised. "Welcome back, Reverend," she said softly. "I knew you'd come." "I'm only here to observe," Thomas said, the lie transparent even to himself. "Of course." Eleanor's smile suggested she knew exactly why he was really there. "Observe all you like, though I think you'll find observation alone won't satisfy what you're hungry for." She gestured him inside, and Thomas entered the chapel that was already transforming him. The gathering began like the first one Thomas had witnessed, cushions arranged in a circle, mirrors reflecting impossibly, Eleanor's servants forming their formation. But this time, Thomas sat among the participants instead of fleeing. He watched as Eleanor moved to the center, raising her arms, beginning her speech about flesh and renewal and the honesty of the body. The words washed over him, making more sense than they should. Around him, people began to sway in rhythm with the servants humming. The mirrors grew brighter, and Thomas could see figures moving in their depths, the impossible ballroom where bodies danced in ways that defied anatomy. "Tonight," Eleanor announced, her voice seeming to come from everywhere at once, "we go deeper. For those who've experienced renewal once, we offer transcendence. For those new to our gathering, we offer awakening. And for those who stand between, uncertain and afraid," her eyes found Thomas across the circle, "we offer proof." She snapped her fingers, and her servants began distributing cups of that dark liquid Thomas had seen before. This time, he took one when it was offered. The cup was warm in his hands, the liquid inside smelling of wine and copper, and something organic he couldn't identify. "Drink," Eleanor commanded softly. "Participate in communion, but not the symbolic communion of your churches, Reverend Whitfield. Real communion, flesh acknowledging flesh, blood recognizing blood, the truth that we are all just meat and hunger temporarily assembled into the illusion of individuals." Thomas stared into the cup. This was the moment. If he drank, he would be fully participating, fully surrendering, fully accepting whatever Eleanor offered. If he didn't, he would forever wonder what he'd missed. He raised the cup to his lips and drank. The liquid tasted like everything he'd ever wanted and everything he'd ever feared. Sweet and bitter, familiar and alien. It burned going down, then spread warmth through his chest, his limbs, his mind. The chapel changed. The candlelight took on new dimensions. The humming grew into music he could feel in his bones, rhythms that matched his heartbeat, then began to alter it, speeding it up and slowing it down in patterns that shouldn't be survivable but were. Eleanor began to dance, and her servants danced with her. Not the restrained movements of church worship, but something primal and honest. Bodies moving without shame, expressing hungers without apology. Around the circle people stood and joined the dance. Thomas felt himself rising too, though he couldn't remember deciding to stand. His body moved independently of his will, responding to rhythms older than consciousness. In the mirrors, he saw himself dancing, but also saw other versions of himself, the Thomas who'd never entered seminary, the Thomas who'd given in to every temptation, the Thomas who'd been honest about his doubts from the beginning, all of them dancing together, merging and separating like water flowing. Eleanor was beside him suddenly, her cold hand taking his. "Do you see now?" she asked, her voice cutting through the music. "Do you understand what I'm offering?" Thomas tried to speak, but found his voice gone. In the mirror behind Eleanor, he saw something that made his blood freeze, a vast darkness pressing against the glass, something hungry and ancient trying to push through from the other side. "Don't be afraid," Eleanor whispered. "That's just truth. That's what exists beneath the lies of civilization and faith. Raw existence, pure hunger. The void that we all came from and will all return to." She pulled him closer, and Thomas couldn't resist. "Your God never answered your prayers, Reverend, because your God was never there. But this," she gestured to the darkness in the mirrors, "this is always there, always hungry, always honest about what it wants." "What does it want?" Thomas managed to ask. Eleanor's smile was radiant and terrible. "Everything. The same thing all of existence wants, to consume, to grow, to spread. And I'm helping it do exactly that, one freed soul at a time." Thomas wanted to pull away, to run, to reject everything she was showing him, but his body wouldn't obey. The liquid he'd drunk had done something to him, opened pathways in his mind that shouldn't exist. He could feel the darkness Eleanor spoke of. Feel it, pressing against the boundaries of reality, hungry for entrance. And horrifyingly, part of him wanted to let it in. "That's it," Eleanor encouraged, sensing his wavering resistance. "Stop fighting. Accept what you are, meat and electricity pretending to have meaning. Accept what the world is, a cold machine grinding through eternity without purpose or plan. Accept that your faith was always just fear dressed in hope." The darkness in the mirrors grew more defined. Thomas could see shapes within it now, figures that might have been human once, but had been changed by something that understood flesh better than any surgeon. They reached toward the glass with too many hands, calling to him in voices that sounded like his own thoughts. "Let them through," Eleanor whispered. "Say yes to truth. Say yes to renewal. Say yes to—" Lightning struck. The entire chapel blazed with sudden, brilliant light. Thunder crashed so loud it felt like the world splitting. Every candle extinguished simultaneously, plunging the space into darkness, broken only by the strange glow from the mirrors. Eleanor released Thomas's hand with a sharp hiss. "No," she said, her voice losing its honeyed tone. "Not now. Not yet." The chapel doors burst open, and rain poured in, hard, cold summer rain that felt like absolution. The storm had finally broken, and wind swept through the space, scattering cushions and extinguishing even the strange light from the mirrors. People screamed. The servants' humming dissolved into chaos. In the darkness and confusion, Thomas found his will returning, the spell of the liquid breaking under the shock of the storm. He stumbled toward the doors, pushing past bodies desperate for air and rain, and anything that felt clean. He emerged into the downpour and kept running, his feet splashing through mud, rain soaking him to the skin. Behind him he could hear Eleanor shouting something, but her words were lost in thunder. Thomas ran until his lungs burned, until his legs gave out, until he collapsed in a field somewhere between the plantation and town. He lay in the mud and rain, gasping, his mind clearing slowly like fog, burning off under sunlight. He'd almost done it, almost surrendered completely, almost let that darkness in. The realization made him vomit into the wet grass, purging whatever he'd drunk along with his terror. When the storm passed an hour later, Thomas dragged himself back to town. He went straight to his room, stripped off his muddy clothes, and found the letter he'd written to his superior. Without allowing himself time to reconsider, he sealed it, addressed it, and placed it in the Morning Post. Then he collapsed onto his bed and slept for 16 hours straight. The letter took 3 days to reach Savannah, and another 2 for a response to arrive. During that time, Thomas remained in his room, refusing visitors, eating little, sleeping fitfully. He could still feel echoes of what Eleanor had shown him, the darkness behind reality, the hunger in the void, the terrible possibility that everything he believed was fiction. His faith hung by threads. When the response came, it wasn't what he expected. The Methodist Church's regional superintendent, Reverend Marcus Holloway, arrived in person accompanied by 2 other ministers and a doctor. They met with Thomas in his room, their faces grave. "Your letter was concerning," Holloway said carefully. He was a man in his 60s with white hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades managing difficult situations. "The claims you've made about this woman, Eleanor Beaumont, they're quite extraordinary." "They're true," Thomas insisted. "Every word. She's corrupting people, changing them somehow. And she's doing it in the name of spiritual renewal, which makes it even more insidious." Holloway exchanged glances with the other ministers. "Thomas, have you been under unusual stress lately? The doctor tells me you've barely eaten in days, that you seem to be experiencing some form of nervous exhaustion." "I'm not insane," Thomas said flatly. "I know how it sounds, but if you'll just investigate, go to Ashford Plantation, speak with her, observe one of her gatherings." "We did," one of the other ministers interrupted gently. "We visited this morning, Mrs. Beaumont was gracious enough to allow us a complete tour of her property and chapel. We found nothing unusual, just a woman of means conducting unconventional but not illegal worship services." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "She showed you what she wanted you to see. The real gatherings happen at midnight on Saturdays. The things she does then—" "Can you describe these things specifically?" Holloway asked. "Without metaphor or interpretation, what exactly does she do that you believe is harmful?" Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it. How could he explain the mirrors, the darkness they reflected, the way people changed after drinking that liquid? How could he describe feelings and sensations that defied normal description? Everything that had seemed so clear and certain in the chapel became vague and unsubstantial when he tried to put it into words. "I see," Holloway said quietly. "Thomas, I think you've been working too hard. The assignment to this small town, the isolation, the weight of responsibility. It's not uncommon for young ministers to experience crises of faith, to see spiritual warfare where there might only be social discomfort. This isn't a crisis of faith," Thomas protested weakly. But even as he said it, he wondered if it was true. Maybe that's all this was, his doubts and fears projected onto Eleanor Beaumont, turning an eccentric woman into a demon because it was easier to fight external evil than internal uncertainty. "I'm recommending a leave of absence," Holloway continued. "Return to Savannah with us. Rest, pray, restore your spiritual equilibrium. We'll assign another minister to Millbrook temporarily." "But the people here, they need protection from her." "The people here," Holloway said firmly, "are adults who make their own choices about worship and fellowship. Unless Mrs. Beaumont commits an actual crime, we have neither the authority nor the right to interfere with her activities. And frankly, Thomas, Your letter reads less like a rational concern and more like an obsession. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow because they were partially true. He had become obsessed. Eleanor Beaumont occupied his every thought, but that didn't mean she wasn't dangerous. "I'll stay," Thomas said quietly. "I'm not leaving these people to her influence." Holloway sighed. "Then I must insist you see the doctor regularly and refrain from any further confrontation with Mrs. Beaumont. Your position here depends on demonstrating stability and sound judgment. Do I make myself clear?" Thomas nodded, knowing that arguing further would only make him seem more unstable. After the delegation left, he sat in his room and faced an uncomfortable truth. He had no proof, no evidence, nothing that would convince anyone who hadn't experienced Eleanor's gatherings firsthand. He was alone in his fight. That Saturday night, Thomas didn't go to the chapel. He forced himself to stay in his room to resist the pull he felt toward Ashford Plantation. But he couldn't stop thinking about what was happening there, couldn't stop imagining people drinking that liquid, dancing that dance, opening themselves to the darkness Eleanor was inviting through. Around midnight, he heard singing in the streets. He looked out his window to see a group of perhaps 30 people walking through Millbrook, all of them humming that wordless melody. They moved in formation, perfectly synchronized, heading toward the plantation. Martha Porter was among them. So was Jacob Mills. So was Sheriff Coleman himself. Thomas watched them disappear into the darkness and felt utterly powerless. The next morning he woke to find a note slipped under his door. It was written in elegant script on expensive paper. "Reverend Whitfield, I understand you've been spreading concerns about my gatherings. I want you to know I harbor no ill will. In fact, I admire your conviction, even when it's misdirected. But I think it's time we had an honest conversation. Not in the chaos of a gathering, but privately. Just the two of us, discussing theology and truth like civilized people. Come to the chapel on Tuesday evening, 6 o'clock. Come alone, and I promise you'll be free to leave whenever you wish. I simply want to help you understand what I'm truly offering, without the distractions that confused you before. If you don't come, I'll understand. But I think you'll regret not taking this opportunity to get real answers to your questions." Yours in truth, Eleanor Beaumont Thomas crumpled the note, then smoothed it out again, reading it 3 more times. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, but the note also represented something he desperately wanted. Answers, understanding, a chance to look Eleanor Beaumont in the eye and demand she explain herself without the cover of ritual and manipulation. He knew he shouldn't go, but he also knew he would. Tuesday arrived too quickly. Thomas spent the intervening days preparing, not physically but mentally. He prayed more intensely than he had since seminary, though the prayers still felt like words thrown into an empty room. He studied scripture, looking for passages about spiritual warfare, about resisting temptation, about maintaining faith in the face of doubt. Nothing felt adequate. At 5:30, he began walking to Ashford Plantation. The evening was clear and warm, the recent storm having washed away the oppressive humidity. Birds sang in the oak trees, and the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was too beautiful for what Thomas was walking toward. The plantation looked different in early evening light, less threatening. The main house, still derelict, cast long shadows, but didn't seem sinister. The chapel looked like what it was supposed to be, a small stone building dedicated to worship, its architecture simple and honest. Eleanor waited outside the chapel doors, wearing a simple grey dress instead of her usual mourning black or that unsettling white. She looked almost normal, a wealthy woman waiting to receive a guest. "Thank you for coming," she said as Thomas approached. "I know it took courage." "I'm not afraid of you," Thomas lied. Eleanor's smile suggested she knew the truth, but wouldn't call him on it. "Come inside. I've prepared tea. We'll talk like adults, without performance or spectacle." The The chapel interior had been cleared of mirrors and cushions. It now held 2 chairs and a small table with tea service positioned near the altar. Natural light streamed through the windows, making everything look ordinary and peaceful. Thomas sat warily, accepting the cup of tea Eleanor poured, but not drinking from it. "You don't trust me," Eleanor observed, sitting across from him. "I don't blame you. Everything you've witnessed has been designed to disorient, to break down barriers, to create experiences that transcend normal consciousness. That's genuinely frightening if you're not prepared for it. So you admit you're manipulating people." "I'm facilitating experiences," Eleanor corrected. "There's a difference. Manipulation implies deception. I'm absolutely honest about what I'm offering. Liberation from the lies society tells us about the body and the self. You're offering damnation. According to your worldview, yes." Eleanor sipped her own tea calmly. "But Reverend Whitfield, what if your worldview is wrong? What if there is no damnation because there's no God to damn anyone? What if the only judgment we face is the one we inflict on ourselves through guilt and shame?" "That's exactly what a demon would say." Eleanor laughed genuinely. "Fair enough. But let me ask you something. In all your prayers, in all your years of faith, has God ever answered you? I mean really answered. Not through coincidence you interpreted as providence, but directly, unmistakably." Thomas wanted to say yes, but honesty compelled him to remain silent. "I thought not," Eleanor said gently. "You've been praying into silence your entire life, Reverend, building faith on nothing but hope and fear and social conditioning. I'm simply suggesting there might be better foundations for living. Better. You've turned people into empty shells. Samuel Porter has been missing for weeks. Martha Porter barely functions. Jacob Mills are all experiencing difficult transitions," Eleanor interrupted. "Growth is painful, Reverend. Shedding old skins always hurts. But on the other side of that pain is something magnificent, the freedom to be exactly what they are, without apologizing for biological imperatives. You keep talking about freedom, but everyone who attends your gatherings becomes like your servants, silent, compliant, glazed." "In the beginning, yes." Eleanor set down her teacup. "The initial awakening overwhelms. The conscious mind struggles to integrate what it experiences. But given time, they emerge stronger, more authentic. I have dozens of people in this community now who've completed the process. They live richer, more honest lives than they did before. They live like animals." "Why? They live like honest animals," Eleanor corrected, "which is better than living as dishonest humans, constantly performing virtue they don't feel, denying hungers they can't eliminate, building entire lives on foundations of repression and shame." Thomas leaned forward. "Why are you doing this? What do you actually want?" For the first time, Eleanor's composed mask slipped slightly. Something hungry moved behind her eyes. "I want to free people," she said, her voice taking on an edge of passion. "I want to tear down the structures that make them small and afraid and guilty for existing. I want them to feel what I felt when I woke up to truth." "What truth? What happened to you, Eleanor?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost vulnerable. "I was married once, in Charleston, to a good man," everyone said, "wealthy, respected, devout. He beat me in private and praised me in public. He controlled every aspect of my life while preaching about marital sanctity, and I endured it because I'd been taught that was what good Christian women did." Thomas felt unexpected sympathy stirring despite himself. "When he died, pneumonia, not by my hand, though I'd fantasized about it, I inherited everything. Money, property, freedom." Eleanor looked up, meeting Thomas's eyes. "And I realized I'd wasted years of my life being what others expected, following rules that served everyone except me, believing promises that were never kept. So you decided to corrupt others out of revenge. I decided to save others from my fate. Eleanor corrected sharply. I'm offering what no one offered me, permission to be real. To acknowledge that the body isn't shameful, that desire isn't sinful, that the only meaning in this brief existence is what we can feel and taste and experience before we return to nothing. That's nihilism. That's honesty. Eleanor stood, pacing to one of the windows. You feel it too, Reverend. I saw it in you that night when you attended. The doubt, the suspicion that everything you've built your life on might be empty. That's why you came back Saturday. That's why you're here now. You're hungry for truth, even though it terrifies you. Thomas couldn't deny it, but he forced himself to ask the question that mattered most. The darkness in the mirrors. The figures trying to push through. What are those? Eleanor turned from the window, her expression unreadable. Would you believe me if I told you? Try me. She moved closer, standing directly in front of him. They're us, Reverend. They're what humans become when we strip away every lie, every civilizing pretense, every denial of what we really are. Pure appetite, pure hunger, pure honest need. They're the truth we carry inside, made visible. They look demonic. Because you've been taught to see honesty as demonic, but they're not evil, Reverend. They're just real, and reality, when you're raised on fairy tales, looks monstrous. Thomas stood, needing distance. I don't believe you. There's something more, something you're not telling me. Those figures want something. They're trying to break through into our world. Why? Eleanor's smile returned, sad and knowing. Because this world is full of meat they can't taste, experiences they can't have, flesh they can't touch. They're hungry for incarnation, and I'm helping provide it. By giving them people, by giving people truth, Eleanor insisted. What happens after? The transformation, the integration. That's just the natural result of consciousness accepting its real nature. That's possession. That's evolution. They stared at each other across the small chapel, two people with incompatible worldviews, reaching an impasse neither could cross. Finally, Thomas said, I'm going to stop you. You can't, Eleanor replied simply. Too many people want what I'm offering. Too many are tired of guilt and shame and living small. You're fighting human nature itself, Reverend, and that's a battle you'll never win. I have to try. Eleanor's expression softened. I know, and I respect that, truly. But Thomas, may I call you Thomas? You're exhausting yourself fighting the inevitable. Join me instead. Let me show you the full truth. Not the fragments you experienced before, but everything. And then decide for yourself whether I'm saving souls or damning them. Never. We'll see. Eleanor moved to the chapel doors, opening them. You're free to go, as promised. But think about what I've said, about how much of your life has been performance, about how rarely your prayers are answered, about whether faith built on nothing but hope is really worth maintaining. Thomas walked past her into the cooling evening. At the threshold, he paused. Why do you wear mourning clothes? Eleanor touched the grey dress she wore. This isn't mourning, despite the colour. I buried Eleanor Beaumont the day my husband died. The woman wearing her name now is something new, something honest. She smiled. Something free. Thomas left without responding, walking back toward Millbrook as darkness gathered. Behind him, he could feel Eleanor watching, and in his peripheral vision, he thought he saw figures moving in the chapel windows. Shadows that shouldn't exist in natural light, shapes that pressed against the glass as if testing its strength. He walked faster. The weeks following Thomas's private meeting with Eleanor Beaumont felt like watching a slow-motion catastrophe unfold. More people attended her Saturday gatherings, 50, 70, over 100 by mid-July. The changed outnumbered the unchanged now, and Millbrook itself began to transform. Businesses closed earlier, churches emptied. People stopped maintaining the careful distance that civilized society required, touching casually, embracing openly, moving through town with a languid physicality that made Thomas's skin crawl. But nothing illegal occurred, no violence, no overt crime, just a community gradually shedding the structures that had defined it. embracing something else in their place. Samuel Porter finally reappeared in early August, walking into town at dawn looking skeletal but radiant. He went directly to his house, where Martha greeted him with an embrace that lasted far too long for propriety. When Thomas tried to speak with him later that day, Samuel looked through him as if he were transparent. "I was lost," Samuel said quietly. "Now I'm found." The old words, but for the first time they mean something real. "Samuel, please. Whatever Eleanor did to you, she freed me." Samuel's smile was beatific and terrible. "She showed me what I was denying. And now I'm more myself than I've ever been. You should thank her, Reverend. She does work you claim to do, but never actually accomplish, actually transforming people." He walked away, leaving Thomas standing alone on the street. That night, Thomas wrote another letter to his church superiors, more desperate than the first. He described the complete transformation of Millbrook, the way Eleanor's influence had spread like infection, the 100+ people now attending her gatherings. He begged for intervention, for investigation, for something. The response came 2 weeks later. "Continue to minister to those who still attend church. Do not interfere with Mrs. Beaumont's activities unless they become overtly criminal. Your obsession with this woman is concerning. We recommend again that you take a leave of absence." Thomas crumpled the letter. He was on his own. The breaking point came on the last Saturday of August. Thomas had spent weeks trying to organize the unchanged, the 30 or 40 people in Millbrook who still resisted Eleanor's influence. But they were afraid, disorganized, and unsure what action they could even take. Eleanor broke no laws. Her followers seemed happy. What grounds existed for opposition? "Maybe we should just leave," suggested William Carter, one of the few remaining church elders. They met in secret in Carter's barn, afraid of being overheard by the changed. "Pack up, move to Augusta or Savannah, start over somewhere she hasn't reached, and leave her to spread," Thomas demanded. "How long before she moves to another town, then another, before this infection reaches Augusta, Savannah, Charleston itself?" "Infection?" Carter shook his head. "I don't like what she's doing any more than you, Reverend, but calling it infection suggests disease. These people chose to attend, chose to listen. We can't force them to resist something they want." That was the problem, Thomas realized. Eleanor offered what people secretly craved: permission to shed guilt, to embrace desire, to stop performing virtue, and just exist. Fighting that was like fighting gravity, unless he fought differently. The idea came to him that night as he lay sleepless in his room. Eleanor's power came from her chapel, from the mirrors, the rituals, the space itself. What if that space no longer existed? What if it burned? The thought should have horrified him. Arson was serious crime, potentially murder if anyone was inside, but Thomas found himself considering it with cold calculation. Saturday's gathering would end around 3 in the morning. If he waited until everyone had left, until Eleanor and her servants were in the main house sleeping, he could burn the chapel, destroy the mirrors, eliminate the physical space where she worked her corruption. It wouldn't stop Eleanor entirely, but it would slow her, buy time for intervention, send a message that some people still resisted. Thomas spent the next week in prayer, seeking guidance, but the silence from heaven continued, as it always had. Eventually he decided that God's silence was itself an answer. Act. Do what you believe is right. Take responsibility for your own choices. On Friday, he prepared carefully. He collected lamp oil, rags, matches. He wrote final letters to his family explaining his actions. He made peace with whatever consequences would follow. Saturday night arrived with clear skies and warm temperatures. Thomas watched from a distance as over 100 people walked to Ashford Plantation, humming that melody, moving in their synchronized formation. He waited in the darkness, patient, feeling oddly calm. The gathering lasted until 3:30 in the morning. Thomas watched people emerge from the chapel, changed in that way he'd come to recognize: glazed eyes, fluid movements, faces showing rapture or exhaustion, or both. They dispersed into the night, heading back to town. Eleanor was last to leave, her servants behind her. She locked the chapel doors, unnecessarily, since who would dare enter uninvited, and walked to the main house, which now showed signs of habitation in the east wing. Candles lit windows, shadows moved behind curtains. After an hour, even those lights extinguished. Thomas waited another hour to be certain. Then he moved. He approached the chapel from the rear, carrying his supplies in a bag. The doors were locked, but the windows were narrow and high, meant for light, not security. Thomas broke one carefully with a wrapped stone, the sound muffled by cloth. He waited, listening for any response. None came. He climbed through, dropping into the chapel interior. In the darkness, the space felt different. Without candlelight, without people. It was just a stone room with too many mirrors. Thomas could see his reflection multiplied in the moonlight. Dozens of Thomases, all of them doing something terrible, all of them looking exhausted and desperate. He began methodically. Rags, soaked in lamp oil, placed against the walls where the wooden supports were weakest. More rags piled near the altar, oil splashed across the mirrors, turning them opaque. He worked quickly but carefully, making sure the fire would spread but giving himself time to escape. When everything was prepared, Thomas struck a match. The flame looked impossibly small in the vast darkness, just a pinprick of light against shadow. But when Thomas touched it to the oil-soaked rags, fire bloomed like a flower opening. It spread faster than he'd expected. The oil caught immediately, flames racing along the walls, climbing toward the wooden ceiling supports. Heat pushed at Thomas, forcing him back. The mirrors began to crack from the temperature, splitting with sounds like screaming. Thomas moved toward the broken window, ready to climb out. But as he turned, movement in the intact mirrors caught his eye. Figures, the same shapes he'd seen pressing against the glass before, but now they were moving frantically, desperately, as if the fire threatened them too. Their mouths opened in silent screams. And as the mirrors cracked and shattered, something that might have been smoke or might have been shadow poured out. Thomas ran. He scrambled through the window, dropped into the grass outside, and ran toward the tree line. Behind him, the chapel began to truly burn, flames reaching through the roof, illuminating the night sky with flickering orange light. Shouts came from the main house. Eleanor and her servants emerged, staring at the fire. But they didn't try to fight it. They simply stood watching, and even from a distance, Thomas could see Eleanor's face, not shocked or angry, but coldly furious, calculating. Thomas watched from the trees as the chapel burned. The flames grew impossibly bright, taking on colors that shouldn't exist in normal fire. Blues and greens and violets mixed with the natural orange. The heat was so intense that even from 50 yards away, Thomas felt his face burning. The servants stood in their silent formation, watching. But Eleanor moved closer to the fire, close enough that she should have been burned by the heat. She raised her arms as if conducting an orchestra, and Thomas swore he heard her voice cutting through the roar of flames, not shouting, but speaking in that same measured tone she always used. The fire changed. Instead of spreading outward toward the other buildings, it contained itself, burning hotter and brighter, but not growing. The blue flames intensified until Thomas had to shield his eyes. In the heart of the fire, Thomas saw movement. The figures from the mirrors were fully visible now, dancing in the flames as if the heat gave them form rather than destroying it. They twisted and writhed, their bodies constantly shifting between human and something else, their faces showing expressions of agony and ecstasy indistinguishable from each other. Eleanor was calling to them. Thomas couldn't make out the words, but her voice had a rhythmic quality, almost like the wordless humming of her gatherings. The figures in the flames responded, pressing toward her, reaching with hands that seemed more solid with each passing moment. Thomas realized with horror what was happening. The fire wasn't destroying Eleanor's work, it was completing it. The heat, the destruction of the physical chapel, the shattering of the mirrors, all of it was breaking down the last barriers between worlds. He hadn't stopped her. He'd helped her. "No," Thomas whispered, then shouted, "No!" Eleanor turned her head slightly, acknowledging his presence for the first time. Even across the distance he could see her smile. The chapel's roof collapsed inward with a roar like thunder. Sparks exploded upward into the night sky, and for just a moment the blue flames blazed so bright that Thomas saw everything illuminated like daylight. The plantation, the fields, Eleanor's face radiant with triumph. Then the flames began to die, not gradually but suddenly, as if someone had closed a door. Within minutes, the inferno had reduced to ordinary fire, consuming what remained of the chapel's timber supports. The blue had vanished entirely. Thomas stepped from the trees, drawn forward despite his fear. The chapel was destroyed, walls cracked and blackened, roof gone, nothing remaining but stone and ash. He'd accomplished what he intended, even if the process had been horrifying. But Eleanor stood before the ruins, and she was laughing. "Thank you, Reverend," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the scorched ground. "I've been trying to complete that ritual for weeks, but I needed heat I couldn't generate safely." "You provided it perfectly." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "What did you do?" "What I've been trying to do since I arrived." Eleanor turned from the ruins to face him fully. "The mirrors were always just tools, Reverend, training wheels, a way to let people glimpse what exists beyond the veil of normal perception. But they were also limitations. They could show but not fully integrate. But fire transforms. Fire breaks down and rebuilds. Fire completes. You're insane. I'm successful." Eleanor moved toward him, and Thomas saw that her grey dress was unmarked by ash, despite her proximity to the flames. "Every person who attended my gatherings and saw the figures in the mirrors, they were marked, prepared. Tonight's fire sealed that preparation, burned away the last barriers. They'll complete their transformations now, become what they were always meant to be." "What are you?" Thomas demanded, his voice breaking. "You're not human. You can't be." Eleanor tilted her head, considering the question. "I was human once. Eleanor Beaumont was entirely human when she buried her husband in Charleston. But grief and rage and hunger for truth can change a person, Reverend, can open them to experiences that alter fundamental nature. I looked into the void, really looked, without flinching, and the void looked back. And what looked back offered me a bargain." "What bargain?" "Freedom from human limitation in exchange for service." Eleanor smiled. "I give it access to human flesh, willing flesh, eager flesh, and in return I get to watch the structures I hate crumble. Churches emptied, families dissolved, the careful hypocrisies of civilization torn away. It's remarkably satisfying." Thomas backed away. "I'll tell everyone. I'll expose you." "Tell them what? That you committed arson and then blamed me for it? That you believe in demons possessing people through fire?" Eleanor's laughter was genuine. "No one will believe you, Reverend. And by tomorrow it won't matter anyway. The transformation will be complete. Millbrook will be the first, but not the last. This will spread from town to town, county to county. Eventually the whole world will be freed from the lies you and your kind have perpetuated. God will stop you." "Your God had his chance," Eleanor said coldly. "I've been offering him opportunities to intervene for months. Where was his lightning to strike me down? Where were his angels to protect his flock? He's silent, Reverend. He's always been silent, because either he doesn't exist or he doesn't care. Either way, he's not coming to save you." Thomas wanted to argue, to defend his faith, to proclaim God's justice, but the words stuck in his throat. Because Eleanor was right about one thing, his prayers had gone unanswered. His pleas for intervention had met only silence. Maybe God was silent because God wasn't there, or maybe, and this thought chilled him deeper than any horror Eleanor could create, maybe God was silent because he was watching to see what Thomas would do, whether he would fight even without hope of victory, whether he would maintain faith even when it brought no comfort. "I'm not giving up," Thomas said quietly. "Even if I'm fighting alone, even if there's no divine intervention coming. I'm not letting you destroy these people without resistance." Eleanor studied him with something that might have been respect. "You know what, Reverend? I believe you. You'll fight until you can't fight anymore. It's admirable in its futility." She turned back toward the main house, her servants falling into step behind her. "But it doesn't matter. You already lost. The fire sealed it. By dawn, Millbrook will be mine, and you'll have no one left to minister to except yourself." She walked away, leaving Thomas standing alone before the smouldering ruins of the chapel. Thomas ran back to town as the eastern sky began to lighten. He had to warn people, had to try to stop whatever Eleanor claimed would happen at dawn. But as he reached Millbrook's outskirts, he realized he was too late. People were emerging from their homes, not panicked or confused, but moving with deliberate purpose. The changed ones, those who'd attended Eleanor's gatherings, walked toward the center of town, converging like rivers flowing to a common delta. Thomas ran to the church, hoping to find sanctuary or at least other unchanged people. But the church was empty. He rang the bell frantically, the sound clanging across the town, a desperate alarm. No one came. He ran through the streets, seeing the changed ones gathering in the town square. They stood in concentric circles, hundreds of them now, holding hands and humming that wordless melody. In the center stood Martha Porter and Samuel Porter, Jacob Mills, Sheriff Coleman, all the people Thomas had known and tried to help. They were changing further as he watched, not dramatically, not into monsters, but subtly. Their eyes reflected light strangely, their movements synchronized perfectly, as if they were parts of a single organism. When they spoke, their voices harmonized in ways human voices shouldn't be able to harmonize. "Reverend Whitfield," they said in unison, every voice speaking the same words at the same moment. "Join us. Stop fighting. Accept truth." Thomas backed away, horror crawling up his spine. This was worse than he'd imagined. Not possession in the traditional sense, but something more insidious. Consciousness merged, individuality dissolved, humanity preserved, but fundamentally altered. "Join us," they repeated, and now they were moving toward him, the circles breaking to form a closing net. "Feel what we feel, know what we know, be free." Thomas ran. He ran through empty streets, past abandoned homes, toward the edge of town. Behind him, he could hear them following, not running, but walking, with that same synchronized step, patient and inevitable. He didn't know where he was going. There was nowhere to go. If Eleanor was right, this would spread beyond Millbrook. But maybe he could warn someone. Maybe he could get word to Augusta, to Savannah, to someone with authority to investigate properly. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, collapsing in a cotton field a mile outside town. The sun was fully risen now, heat already building. Thomas lay in the dirt between rows of cotton plants, gasping, defeated. In the distance, he could see Millbrook. Smoke still rose from the ruins of Ashford Plantation's chapel, but the town itself looked normal, buildings standing, streets peaceful, everything exactly as it should be, except everyone in it had been transformed into something else. Thomas pulled himself to his feet and kept walking, away from Millbrook, toward Augusta. He had no plan except to survive and warn whoever would listen. Behind him, the changed ones stopped at the edge of town, watching him go. They didn't pursue. They didn't need to. They had time. Thomas Whitfield stood outside the Methodist Church headquarters in Savannah, staring at the building where he'd once trained for ministry. It felt like a lifetime ago. Though barely 5 years had passed, he'd made it to Augusta in late August, half mad with exhaustion and fear. The authorities there had listened to his story with polite skepticism, promising to investigate Millbrook. 2 weeks later, they sent word that they'd visited the town and found nothing amiss. The citizens seemed remarkably content. the report stated. Mrs. Eleanor Beaumont continues her unconventional worship services, but attendance is voluntary and no laws are being broken. The town's economy is stable. We see no cause for intervention. Thomas tried to explain that content didn't mean healthy, that the changed behavior was itself evidence of corruption, but without concrete proof of crime, the authorities could do nothing. He'd spent September writing letters to every church authority he could reach, every newspaper that might publish his account. Most ignored him. A few printed, edited versions that made him sound like a religious fanatic, ranting about moral decay. In October, he heard that Eleanor had purchased property near Augusta, then near Savannah. Her gatherings were spreading, drawing curious seekers from across Georgia. The pattern was repeating: voluntary attendance, transformed behavior, no obvious crime. By November, Thomas had been officially dismissed from ministry. "Your obsession with Mrs. Beaumont has made you ineffective as a spiritual leader," Reverend Holloway wrote. "We recommend you seek medical help for what appears to be a persecution complex." Now, in late November, Thomas stood outside the church headquarters with nothing left to lose. He'd come to make one final appeal, to beg them to investigate properly before Eleanor's influence spread too far to contain. But as he watched people walking past on the Savannah street, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. 3 of them were humming that wordless melody. 2 others moved with that synchronized fluidity he'd learned to recognize. It was already here. Eleanor had reached Savannah. Thomas walked away from the church headquarters without going inside. What was the point? No one would believe him until it was too late, and maybe it already was too late. He walked through Savannah's streets, lost in despair, until he found himself at the waterfront. Ships sat at anchor in the harbor, preparing to sail to Charleston, to New York, to ports across the world. Thomas watched them and thought about Eleanor's words. "This will spread. Eventually, the whole world will be freed." Was she right? Would her influence eventually transform all of humanity into those changed ones, synchronized, merged, freed from guilt and shame and individuality? Or would someone somewhere find a way to stop her? Thomas didn't know, but as he stood watching the ships, he felt the last threads of his faith snap. If God existed, he was allowing this. If God existed, he was watching Eleanor Beaumont corrupt humanity and doing nothing. And if God was doing nothing, then what was the difference between a silent God and no God at all? Thomas walked to the nearest bar and ordered whiskey. He drank until the questions stopped mattering, until the memory of that night at the chapel, the fire, the blue flames, Eleanor's triumphant smile, faded to something he could live with. He never returned to ministry. Over the following years, he would occasionally hear reports of Eleanor Beaumont's spreading influence. New towns transformed. New followers attracted, always voluntary, always legal, always spreading. Sometimes, in his darker moments, Thomas wondered if he should have joined them, if fighting the inevitable was just another form of suffering. If Eleanor's freedom was preferable to his faithless existence. But he never went back to Millbrook, never attended another one of Eleanor's gatherings, never stopped believing in some small corner of his soul that he'd been right to resist, even when resistance accomplished nothing. In Charleston, in a grand house overlooking the harbor, Eleanor Beaumont sat before a mirror, the one that had survived the chapel fire unbroken. In its reflection, she could see not just herself, but the network she'd created. Hundreds of changed ones, spread across Georgia and South Carolina, all connected, all part of something larger than themselves. The fire had worked better than she'd hoped. The intense heat had completed the integration, allowed the entities from beyond the mirrors to fully merge with human consciousness. Now her followers carried that connection within them, spreading it to others through proximity and persuasion. It would take years to transform the whole world, decades perhaps, but Eleanor had time and patience. And most importantly, she had willing participants, people so hungry for relief from guilt and shame that they embraced transformation gratefully. In the mirror, she could see Thomas Whitfield drinking in that Savannah bar. Part of her felt genuine sympathy for him. He'd tried so hard, fought so bravely, maintained conviction even when it brought only suffering. But conviction without power was just tragedy in slow motion. "Sleep well, Reverend," Eleanor said to his reflection. "You'll dream of fire and mirrors, and perhaps someday you'll understand that I was offering salvation, not damnation, freedom, not corruption, truth, not lies." She stood and moved away from the mirror. Behind her, in the reflection, the ballroom filled with dancing figures appeared, more solid now, more real, pressing against reality's boundaries with increasing success. Soon, those boundaries would dissolve entirely. Soon, the separation between worlds would be meaningless. Soon, humanity would be transformed into something that existed in both realms simultaneously. Flesh and spirit merged, appetite and consciousness unified. Eleanor Beaumont smiled and began to hum that wordless melody. In Millbrook, hundreds hummed with her. In Augusta, dozens joined the chorus. In Savannah, the first few began to learn the tune. The song was spreading, patient and inevitable as infection, beautiful and terrible as truth. And Thomas Whitfield drank his whiskey and tried not to hear it. But in the silent spaces between his thoughts, between his heartbeats, between his breaths, he heard it still. He would always hear it. Some songs, once learned, could never be forgotten.